This is my second part of my American internal conflict, the second American internal conflict, or civil conflict, Syrian style. So, some of the stuff discussed in it will be, for sensitive people, it might be a little too much. So, listener and viewer discretion is advised for this documentary series, the whole thing. But it'll begin. Hey, Brogan, good to see you. It'll begin with the reading of the storyline, and after that will be the battles, some of the things going on, and the leaders. And that will also, it'll be some of the leaders shown, with the rest being shown in the third video. So without further ado, here we go. It was the morning of July the 1st, as civil unrest and violent rioting gripped the entire nation, from coast to coast, in many of its major and even some of its medium-sized cities. The same couldn't be said of its capital, D.C. The city was locked down, tighter than a knot on a shoe, pulled as strongly as possible while tying a shoe. As per the shadowy globalist regime's edicts, several local units were deployed in the city to stifle any potential signs of civil disobedience and unrest, as well as a sign of and show of force to keep any other activities of would-be rebellion in check. However, the silence of the early morning would soon be shattered, as regime puppet rulers met with their billionaire and even a few trillionaire Western globalist overlords to discuss the next steps in their plans to implement the next phase of their Great Reset, Build Back Better scheme. A group of generals representing the Air Force, Army, Marines, and even one Navy admiral, forming a junta, were about ready to implement their plans for a coup. Its purpose and stated endgame: to remove and arrest the globalists and reinstall the USA Constitution and its original republic as its form of government. Already, however, the Pentagon had mobilized and deployed the DC Guard units, namely the 372nd MP Battalion with the 547th Transport Company, backed up and supported by the 104th Maintenance Company, to provide the necessary logistical backing for the deployed vehicles of the aforementioned, keeping them running, although parts and POL products were very limited across the whole military by this point in time. Also mobilized and stated to arrive later in the day was the 1st Battalion of the 224th Aviation Regiment. They were primarily a security and support battalion for the regiment. The 1st of the 224th Aviation Regiment was also of the DC National Guard. Of the Air Guard, though highly curtailed via a general lack of fuel available, was the local 121st Fighter Squadron, flying F-16D fighter jets, as well as the 201st Airlift Squadron, largely grounded as well, also due to fuel constraints. America had come to heavily depend upon fuel imports, as it consumed 3.2 billion barrels per year up to that point, with the whole DoD itself using some 4,599,000,000 barrels annually, with the Air Force consuming the most fuel of any branch at roughly 2.5 billion per year, or nearly half of all military consumption. To put it into perspective, the whole DoD in one day consumes roughly 269,230 barrels, and one Army division per day, 6,000 gallons, or 143 barrels. Already, the DoD was consuming humongous quantities of fuel just to mobilize small units in the local CAP region. But also, all the other units of the armed forces and alphabet gang paramilitary elements, who themselves were all beginning to be merged into a single element or agency, in quotes, called simply the National Security Forces. As the wicked uber rich and their puppets met in a secret bunker below the presidential residence to plot and scheme their evil takeover plans, mostly hinging upon psyops and intimidation in a couple areas, as they did not have the personnel numbers or the logistical capability to be everywhere all at once, ubiquitously, occupying the entire land. They hadn't fully realized that apart from all the rioting, crime, chaos, turmoil, and civil unrest in general, multiple groups and factions were rising up out of the shadows with plans of their very own, including a junta of military leaders of very high ranks who put the regime and its globalist overlords on their menu. The junta of what would soon be called the Free American Army faction prepared for their coup. Lieutenant General Mathis, the commander of all Army Reserve units, whose office was at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, prepared his final op orders, or operational orders, for the coup, as all the other coup-plotters had already found loyal sub-commanders and briefed them on the mission. This one was top secret and had no room whatsoever for failure. Coup forces involved elements of the 103rd Armored Regiment of the Pennsylvania National Guard, as well as one platoon of the Navy's SEAL Team 2, who are mostly stationed in Europe, but with one platoon on rotation back to the United States at its headquarters in Little Creek, Virginia. Also, the 400th MP Battalion of the Army Reserve out of Maryland, and of course, the Navy's USS Lasen, a guided missile destroyer with 96 Tomahawk cruise missiles on board, freshly loaded. Marine Force Recon 2 was to contribute to the coup task force as well. The whole c0nfl1ce Reconnaissance Company, c0nfl1ce Reconnaissance Company out of Camp LeJeune, North Carolina, all 6 of its platoons. Although a few Air Force generals were part of the junta and the coup plot, due to fuel and spare parts constraints, all they could offer was real-time drone intel via a single MQ-9 Reaper drone, with loyal sub-commanders sending encrypted communications and intel reports from monitoring the drone footage at Creech Air Force Base in Nevada, as well as Nellis Air Force Base, Nellis Air Force Warfare Center, who had also some loyal sub-commanders who, for their part, were to cut out the Pentagon's Air Combat Command at Langley Air Force Base to create the necessary chaos to buy time for the coup to occur, while potentially stifling any regime air support thereby sending conflicting information to local Air Force units in the vicinity of the cap, within striking distance. It was imperative for the coup plotters of the junta that no one interfere with their plans in any capacity. It was well understood among the plotters that the regime already had 1,400 local military forces within the city already deployed, with an additional 1,000 on the way, of the 1st Battalion of the 224th Aviation Security and Support Battalion. Another factor was the fairly large concentration of paramilitary forces inside the city and whole metropolitan area, adding another layer of security for the regime. Some 10,000 lurked the streets, looking to brutally crack down upon the first signs of any sort of dissent among the local populace there, while the new National Security Forces paramilitary troops were only essentially glorified SWAT teams with MRAPs or armored personnel carriers and some machine guns, since merging all the former alphabet forces. The coup plotters were fairly confident that their bigger, better firepower and forces could get the job done and done right. The Pennsylvania Guards 103rd Armored Regiment was to be deployed to the tumultuous streets of Philadelphia, a short trip from Fort Indiantown Gap, via the flatbed trucks that the unit's armor of M1A2 Abrams main battle tanks and some Bradley infantry fighting vehicles was being carried upon. However, 1st Battalion was diverted at the last moment onto I-95 southbound towards the cap. They were to arrive off of the first exit before city limits to their bivouac area to offload and prepare for the coup by installing their crew-served machine guns along with offloading one logistical truck which carried various ammo cans of belted ammo for the M250 cal turret machine guns, 7.62 NATO for the 240 Bravos, and coax machine guns. Secretly, Lieutenant Colonel Henson arranged for a secret delivery of shells to the bivouac location via truck as well, as shells weren't to be part of crushing the civil unrest by the regime, just the machine guns and tank tracks running over the crowds like Tiananmen Square. The coup plotters had 500 Frag T shells signed out of the ammo bunkers arranged by their orders, along with the delivery thereof. It was just enough shells to load the tanks nearly full. Also, arrangements were made to acquire 12-tow missiles and 20mm rounds for the Bradleys that equipped the Recon Company of the 103rd 1st Battalion. As the 1st Battalion of the 103rd Armored Regiment moved into position, all its vehicles pre-fueled and already set to go, the platoon of SEAL Team 2 loaded up aboard 4 UH-60 helos sent from the Joint Reserve Base, both Army and Navy, in Cumberland, Maryland, to pick them up. Of the Marine Force Recon's coup forces, their 2nd company was already inbound via Chinook helos. 3 carried the men, who all signed out their weapons as well as live ammunition, allegedly for training, although the truth was far different. They were slated to arrive in 20 more minutes, all as the 103rd Armored Regiment's 1st Battalion loaded up, and Lieutenant Colonel Henson did his final mission briefings to the men on their role and purpose. The MQ Reaper drone was already beginning to now circle the area, raising eyebrows of air traffic controllers, both civil and Air Force, both being reassured that it was for training purposes and for future security operations, being that there was rioting and civil unrest. The 400th MP Battalion, already called up as a reserve unit to help lock down the capital region, already knew its role among its officers, who by now had briefed their non-commissioned officers, their NCOs, who in turn briefed their troops, the lower enlisted. Meanwhile, the USS Lasen prepared its weapons systems and conducted final checks and maintenance services to both its electronic and mechanical systems, as well as the onboard weapons. It began to sail out of port in Norfolk. Captain Teagan was under immense pressure. He, the Navy, and his ship would forever be remembered as a key player in the coup that saved America, in quotes, if all went according to plan. It was now only 5 minutes to go time. Sweat began to bead along Captain Teagan's brow line as his vessel sailed further out to sea, headed north a bit into the Chesapeake. The orders were given to the crew: prepare all systems and acquire all targets. Ready for launch. The targets of the USS Lasen were simple. Installations for the purposes, regime buildings and some key command and control sites on surrounding installations for the purposes of disrupting any sort of effective response to the coup whatsoever at all. Eliminating command and control structures would effectively cripple coordination of local units to be able to formulate a counter-coup on time. The order was passed down. Engage all targets. Fire, snapped Captain Teagan, his fire order repeated by all his subordinates in the bridge. Passed down the line. Less than 2 minutes later, the first Tomahawks left the missile pods, flying one after another, continuing on, sending them sailing towards their targets to the north. While the coup began to get underway, factions such as the fanatically maniacal National Salvation Revolutionary Front and their ultra-nationalist forces, allies, militias, and even some defecting Guard and Reserve units, whose commanders were personal friends of the now retired Colonel McGregor, who began a reign of terror in the central Midwest primarily, but it quickly spread to the east and even to small parts of the southeast as the National Salvation Revolutionary Front's ham radio operators, as well as other forms of communications just prior to being shut off, had spread the messages of the faction's rapid seizure of Lincoln, Omaha, Des Moines, Bismarck, Sioux Falls, Casper, Laramie, Cheyenne, and many other Midwestern cities. Spread to other allies of the National Salvation Revolutionary Front, who eventually joined in and joined their faction, causing them to capture other cities to the east. 1st Squadron of the 134th Cavalry Regiment, essentially a battalion-sized force, but called a squadron as a cavalry term, much like how an artillery battery is a company-sized artillery force, having itself played a key role in the capture of Lincoln, including with all its state officials, moved into seizing all close-by areas around Lincoln, Nebraska, to ensure the new capital city of the National Salvation Revolutionary Front was secure and cleared of any would-be state counter-coup forces of Nebraska. loyal to the globalist regime, who may try to resist the National Salvation Revolutionary Front's massive ultranationalist forces rising up amid the chaos within the land, including the soon-to-be Free American Army faction and their own coup being conducted by their junta leaders, happening virtually simultaneously with the National Salvation Revolutionary Front seizing massive swathes of USA territory. 92nd Troop Command did their part to help ensure Lincoln for the National Salvation, or did their part to help secure Lincoln for the National Salvation Revolutionary Front as well, as did local National Salvation Revolutionary Front militants and militias, along with other such forces spread across the land, from Wyoming to Kentucky, and even parts of Virginia, and also even from Michigan all the way to the south to the Gulf of Mexico, in much of Alabama and parts of Mississippi. Same pattern everywhere. Assassinations of all varieties, planting munitions in the path of potential enemies, guerrilla-style assaults on pro-regime forces, cyber hacking and meddling, and of course, military units defecting, sympathetic to the National Salvation Revolutionary Front, joining in and seizing key cities and weapons depots. Some Air Guard forces joined the National Salvation Revolutionary Front also, wherein 2 instances occurred where F-16Cs and Ds of the South Dakota Air Guard provided direct support to National Salvation Revolutionary Front militants in battle against National Security Forces paramilitaries, namely via strafing and dropping several free-fall Mark 84 500-pound munitions onto enemy columns. Although fuel was very scarce and difficult to come by, the limited use of air power did manage to make a huge difference anytime it could actually be used, so long as spare parts and ground crew and ordnance specialists and electronic and computer and radar technicians were also likewise available. As in the proverbial saying, the stars all had to align, or mostly the Air Force elements were largely grounded, if not. Certain members of the National Salvation Revolutionary Front's Leadership Council, of which the Troika had officially seized control over, at first unofficially, but then officially upon capture of Lincoln and other cities, had begun to get cold feet, to which the Troika responded to by purging them, upon formally declaring themselves as the new 3-man ultranationalist secular humanist dictators of the Leadership Council and the entire National Salvation Revolutionary Front. Beyond that point, the Troika led the National Salvation Revolutionary Front into the most extreme, radical direction possible. Not fascist, as they hated multinational corporations and globalism to an extreme, but rather far beyond traditional conservatism into an ultranationalism so far departed from any concepts known before that they wanted to build a new America, in quotes, off the blood and broken bodies of all globalists, uber-rich, elitists, and all their collaborators, as ultranationalism was diametrically opposed to globalism. However, the NSRF's own unique brand of ultranationalism would leave heinous atrocities and a body count in its wake that was to become the highest of all factions, with the Mormon State a very close second, leaving a comparable body count in its wake also. Meanwhile, in the Cap, D.C., the coup was already well underway, as a battalion of armor and the 103rd Armored Regiment thundered down the city streets, startling many. All the while, cruise missiles struck multiple buildings of importance to the rogue globalist regime throughout the city. Glass shattered of windows, car alarms went off, all from the thunderous booms of each and every Tomahawk strike. The MQ Reaper drone, feeding real-time data to the commanders loyal to the coup junta leaders, who then relayed orders to commanders on the ground. The 2nd Company Force Recon had since disembarked its forces while hovering over the roofs of 3 office buildings, allowing for 5 of its 6 platoons to head down to street level to clear streets ahead of the 103rd's 1st Battalion advance, to ensure that there were no ambushes with any potential anti-tank weapon systems. Meanwhile, the Scout Sniper Platoon of the Force Recon Company, the 2nd, conducted overwatch on rooftops and other scattered positions to protect their forces on the ground, hoping to eliminate any pro-regime tactical commanders on the ground, to throw their forces into disarray and make it easier to defeat them. This was a coup, this was a coup and an inter-services joint operation. Definitely not a standard military op by a long shot. It was a coup. The 400th MP Battalion of the Reserves had the mission of arresting regime officials for their crimes against America, at least the ones who weren't toast due to the Tomahawk strikes already. News of the unfolding coup threw the Joint Chiefs at the Pentagon into a panic, as the resolve to resist was still there. The National Security Forces and local pro-regime small guard units of 1st Battalion, or of 1 battalion and 2 companies, did their best, but were easily brushed aside by the combined might of the Armored Battalion of the 103rd, the Force Recon Company, and elements of the 400th MPs. The role of the recently dropped off SEAL Team 2 platoon from Little Creek, Virginia, was to storm the Pentagon and capture the Joint Chiefs, and to order them to have the rest of the military stand down, so that no attempt at an effective counter-coup could be launched. As they were storming several entrances to the gigantic mega structure in small teams all at once, they took out the posted armed guard forces and entered. Most of the personnel inside were largely unarmed, minus the QRF force, or the Quick Reaction Force, who soon tried to engage them in a 30-minute firefight, which bought the Joint Chiefs just barely enough time to call in the close-by 56th Brigade Combat Team, a striker brigade, also of the Pennsylvania National Guard, like the 103rd Armored Regiment, but it was already in nearby Baltimore, clamping down on rioters, and affirmed its loyalty to the globalist regime by answering the call of the Joint Chiefs, and got on the road for the relatively fast and short drive to the Cap, merely 40-odd minutes away. Although only armed with their crew serves, their HHC, or Headquarters of Headquarters Company, did authorize the handing out of small quantities of AT-4 anti-tank weapons, 2 per striker vehicle, and vehicle in general, and other vehicles in general. But would it be enough? The street battles got more and more intense as minutes wore on. Eventually, the SEALs made it to the Joint Chiefs in their boardroom next to their command center room. The Chiefs were told to stand down and stand down the whole military, while one of the 4-man SEAL teams entered the command center and commanded those working in it to patch through recordings of General Mathis's speech to all commands of all units, branches, posts, installations, and any forces in general. They did as ordered, as they feared what could occur if they didn't otherwise. While the message was very well received by a large portion of the armed forces, there were yet still about 1/3 of it heavily indoctrinated and completely unwilling to disobey the globalist regime. Eventually, fighting intensified upon the arrival of the pro-regime reinforcements of the 56th Brigade Combat Team, who outnumbered drastically the coup forces by now a factor of nearly 17-1, and that's their entire forces. That's their paramilitary and military. The coup, despite coming extremely close to success, was forced to abandon it as the regime forces regrouped from the shock and awe of the stunning tandem blow of tomahawks, tanks, IFVs, and spec ops and MPs serving as a fairly potent infantry force against the regime's large national security forces of 10,000 in the city, the local 1,400 guard troops, and the now arriving 56th Brigade Combat Team of the Stryker forces. The coup forces did manage to inflict a high casualty rate, but lost 10 tanks and 3 Bradleys, which were their infantry fighting vehicles, 70 various personnel, and thus were forced to retreat due to those casualties and the now arriving regime forces. All the rest of the surviving coup forces took what regime prisoners they could take with them as they retreated to link up with other now like-minded units who took General Mathis's words to heart. The regime, though still hanging on by a thread, lost heavily that day in terms of lives, their forces overall throughout the land, and damage done to its headquarters city. All in all, as the conflict began to get underway, it started with a series of small skirmishes and fairly small battles that soon erupted into massive battles with still aspects of low-intensity warfare, but beginning to be mixed now with high-intensity warfare. For its part, the regime did have its underground bases and bunkers that were filled with supplies. But when one would do the math, it would appear that the supplies that they had stockpiled and hoarded all those years were only just enough for some 200,000 personnel for 5 years, because it takes an immense quantity of food, water, fuel to run the underground generators and power plants, and ammunition to secure those facilities, and more, just to run such underground bases. So that was one of the refuge of the globalist regime and its puppeteers. Beginning in the beginning battles were such that they began in different areas, some roughly at the same time. You saw what happened in Lincoln and in the NSRF territory in general, all the way to Kentucky and Virginia, even parts of North Carolina here, from Michigan, an isolated pocket of them here and here, all the way down to parts of Mississippi and Alabama. They would get into skirmishes with Florida, the Army of the Southeast, the Free American Army, whose failed coup was just read off, as well as the Mormon State, who would have enemies of their own. So basically, some of the leaders are as such. You had the Western globalist regime, their emblem being the corporation yellow gold fringed flag. The elites, the uber rich that control the regime, and their puppet leaders. As you can see, the globalist regime, they're seeking to implement the Fourth Industrial Revolution and Great Reset in the nations of the West, which they control largely. They use the American puppet and regime to implement their policies. Other factions arose during this time, one such being the Mormon State, largely out of Utah, that expanded into slivers of Arizona and much of New Mexico and nearly all of Colorado, and barely into Cheyenne in their quest for weapons of mass destruction. They had already acquired the chemical weapons stockpiles of Deseret in Utah and expanded into Colorado, where they seized the chemical weapons stockpiles of Pueblo. They would soon come into conflict with the National Salvation Revolutionary Front in Cheyenne, where both sides were seeking the nuclear weapons at Warren Air Force Base. The Mormon State, so it could do some dastardly deeds around the land to make people convert to their ways, and the N.S.R.F. to have a bargaining chip to end the war and install their new ultra-nationalist, secular humanist regime by using them as a threat to all the other factions and the regime itself. Leaders of the Mormon State included their supreme leader, supreme acolyte, Josiah. Josiah was a certified cult leader, a religious kook. Mormon State emblem was the sword, the Book of Mormon, and the justice scales being used for spiritual justice in their ideology, meaning that if you were found lacking and wanting, you would be beheaded, thrown off a cliff, or otherwise annihilated in other ways, beheading being one of the most common, as well as being tossed off of cliffs and buildings. Supreme acolyte Josiah and his radical brand of Mormonism and his radical sect rapidly seized control over Utah, Colorado, and even expanding into New Mexico, parts of Arizona, and slivers of Nevada too. But that didn't limit their reach. Their reach was not limited to just the Southwest. Due to their ability to launch terrorist-style attacks, they reached out and hit every faction. They hit the Free American Army. They hit the Union of Southwestern Militias. They also hit the regime in its coastal areas, as well as even sending some truck munitions to hit territories further to the east. Rarely, though, did those munitions, those suicide trucks, find their way, as they had to drive through very dangerous roads, often encountering bands of bandits or other factions that would ambush them on their way to conduct their suicidal martyr missions. But largely, these types of activities were mostly relegated to the western portions of the United States, and even expanding into Texas in later stages when they finally reached the Texas border of the recently seceded secessionist Texas Republic. Other leaders comprised the Mormon State's Council of Elders, with Supreme Acolyte Josiah being at the very top. He was the supreme leader of the newly formed Mormon State. Also, his right-hand man of the Mormon State was Grand Acolyte Mordecai. Also another certified religious kook and cult leader. He was the second in command on the Council of Elders for the Mormon State. He was also called and referred to as the commander of the faithful, being the Grand Acolyte, right-hand man to Supreme Acolyte, the supreme leader, Josiah. He was their overall military commander, with all the other acolytes serving in battle beneath him, including all the acolytes on the Council of Elders. The man that began the Brigham Young Brigades that seized control of Utah and the entire Mormon Church by subverting it to and radicalizing it to become the Mormon State was Acolyte Issachar. He was the Council of Elders, he was a member of the Council of Elders who raised up and commanded the Brigham Young Brigades. Then he was transferred to the Called by the Faith forces, which were the foreign volunteer Mormon forces that came in from Brazil, Mexico, Philippines, and other areas that made their way to the Mormon State through the land bridge that they controlled a little later in New Mexico, coming in from Mexico. Oftentimes, this civil war spilled over into neighboring Mexico as Called by the Faith forces trying to enter the Mormon State territory would often clash with the La Raza narco state forces trying to enter their territory in New Mexico, as both factions were also at war with one another. And of course, the leader of the Free American Army, General Mathis himself. He formed the Junta. He is the supreme commander of all Junta officers. He organized the coup with fellow officers who formed the Junta and the Free American Army after the failed coup plot. And he is pro-Constitution, adamantly so. Then, for the National Salvation Revolutionary Front, their troika consisted of Alfred Motufu. He is the son of two Congolese immigrants who legally immigrated to the United States. He was born in America, and he loved his new country. And he was also fascinated with the country of his parents' origin, now called the Democratic Republic of Congo, that had been undergoing civil war for many, many, many years, formerly called Zaire, and ruled by an ultranationalist Congolese man named Mobutu Sese, who Alfred Motufu was utterly fascinated with, minus the kleptocratic aspects of Mobutu's regime, his ultranationalist Congolese regime. He wanted the same for the United States. He is a member of the Troika, the ruling three of the National Salvation Revolutionary Front. He is the political leader within the Troika. He is the propaganda chief of the National Salvation Revolutionary Front, formerly running the radio station called National Salvation Revolutionary Front Radio Station. It was a pirate type of radio station, and it was very primitive in its origins, but it eventually became the voice of their ultra-nationalist ideology, which rapidly spread along with other forms of propaganda, like printouts, leaflets, computer sticks with propaganda information on them, also posters and other imagery against globalism. And it was originally a conservative group that morphed into a radical, extreme direction where they felt the need to purge anybody that they deemed was a threat to their new America. He is also their policy head who sets policy. He is the head also of the paramilitary forces that were originally their roving death squads that committed purges and acts of murder and violence on their enemies. They formed into a paramilitary wing similar to the SS in Nazi Germany or the Republican Guard in Iraq. They formed their own paramilitary wing called the Jolly Roger Death Brigades, and he was their leader of it. Also, in the National Salvation Revolutionary Front's Troika, its ruling leadership was Professor Albertson, a math professor from the University of Iowa, similar in concept to Doik, the math professor in Khmer Rouge in Cambodia that became one of the chief murderers of the Khmer Rouge regime. He was part of their Troika leadership. He was the economic and logistical leader within the Troika. And he was the supreme commandant, rather, of the National Salvation Revolutionary Front's prison system, including its ordinary prisons, its POW camps for rival factions and regime elements who didn't last long in there, and extermination camps where people went to be outright butchered. He has the regular National Salvation Revolutionary Front unit patch, a spear with blood on it. Alfred Motufu had the paramilitary emblem of the Jolly Roger Death Brigades, a different unit within their forces. Then, of course, there was Colonel McGregor of the third and final member of the Troika, the ruling Troika of the National Salvation Revolutionary Front. A very large and well-built man, Colonel McGregor was a former Green Beret, retired for 4 years, who loved his country but wanted to change everything about it. Again, he is part of the ruling Troika of the N.S.R.F. He is its military leader within the Troika, not to be confused with Alfred Motufu, the paramilitary leader of the Jolly Roger Death Brigades. Colonel McGregor runs overall military operations. He conducts them, he coordinates them, and he rules its core forces consisting of military units that defected, mostly from the Guard and Reserves, combined with combat veterans of the prior 2 wars that amalgamated into a core force, as well as all the militias, all 3.8 million men of the militias throughout the large territory of the N.S.R.F. So he basically runs the militias and the core forces, while Alfred Motufu runs the paramilitary Jolly Roger Death Brigades. He coordinates and plans military actions, and he also coordinates all the activities of the Troika, providing a balance between all 3 members and their opinions. The first battle, some of the first battles, rather, occurred when small actions took place in Washington in Oregon, rather, as read in the last part, where a small paramilitary national security force group of 300 men tried to ambush the leader of the Northwestern Conservative Army forces, which he won himself a victory as his vanguard force of 1,000 easily outnumbered and outperformed the small paramilitary force. And through a guerrilla type of small battle, he managed to defeat all of them. But he also had ham radio operators that spread the message to all conservative areas, mostly in eastern Oregon and Washington, leading to a battle there. It was called the Battle of Yakima, Washington. The regime in this battle had very limited artillery shells for their artillery units at the battle, which was due mostly to poor logistics and hastily trying to fly or drive in their supplies. This battle took place after the failed coup and all the other factions arose by July 1st and 2nd. This battle occurred between July the 8th and August the 4th. Total forces involved were 18,000 18,000 regime forces, and the Northwestern Conservative Army, 24,000 forces. The total casualties of this battle were 9,000 of the regime, including 7,000 POWs that were captured of their forces. The Northwestern Conservative Army lost more, with 12,500 casualties, but only 200 taken as POWs. But the results of the battle was that it was the first major victory of the Northwestern Conservative Army, although a Pyrrhic victory, as regime forces in a pocket acted as a harassment force, disrupting any exploitation of the gains of the Northwestern Conservative Army. Many vehicles, weapons, and some ammo and fuel were taken by the Northwestern Conservative Army, albeit in very small amounts. Another result at the end of this battle was that the Echelon Signals Intelligence Facility was captured, with the Yakima Training Center overrun, and Japanese Self-Defense Force equipment in the same installation where the JSDF flies in for training oftentimes for its units due to Japan being small and lack of training areas. The JSDF equipment was taken by the Northwestern Conservative Army forces when they overran the Yakima Training Center. And now we go to the battle map. Here is the Battle of Yakima. The battle began when the Yakima Indian Reservation got the signal, and their chief decided to muster some forces and join up with the Northwestern Conservative Army due to constantly being oppressed by the regime. They had made the choice to ally themselves with the Northwestern Conservative Army forces that had just recently overrun the Yakima Training Center. Regime forces already in Yakima, who were trying to put down some of the rioting that occurred, but also having to rely on woke militias upon their military forces fracturing after the coup and the rise of the N.S.R.F, and also on foreign volunteer forces raised up haphazardly and hastily from refugee centers and regime-controlled areas, comprised a decent amount of the forces there. The residents of Yakima were actually the rioters and not the woke militia forces. They were rioting against regime oppression when the Northwestern Conservative Army rolled into town. When the battle began, These Yakima Native American militias here participated in the battle, moving towards the city from the south, aligned with regular militia forces that were part of the National Conservative Army forces already that were mobilized in the local hinterlands of the city. They too rushed to confront and capture the airport and confront the 364th Regiment's support battalion, combat support battalion rather, who was the force responsible for controlling the airport and maintaining logistical flows into the entire city, as the regime's forces were heavily dependent upon logistics such as ammo, food, fuel, spare parts, POL products, and everything else. The commander of the Northwest Conservative Army forces at this battle, realizing this fully, and also the highway routes being a possible route of resupply, realizing this fully, his forces made a crescent shape around the city of Yakima and began to move in for the kill. Fighting began with a regime artillery unit, the 17th Field Artillery Brigade, and its subordinate battalions, firing at clustering militia forces who they had received intel from that were in the area. The Northwestern Conservative Army, having had freshly captured the stored Japanese self-defense force equipment, had equipped one of their small battalion-sized elements of about 1,000 men with several of the actually working Type 95 Japanese tanks. Japanese tanks are also called Type, like Chinese name their tanks Type. Just for awareness purposes. They're not Chinese made, they're Japanese Type 95 tanks. But they were equipped with some of the Japanese armor, and also a few other support vehicles. And they had another militia battalion accompanying them to where they set up as close as they could get across the Yakima River here, outside of the city, and began to lob tank shells that were discovered also in the Yakima Training Center. And they lobbed their tank shells at the artillery forces here of the 17th Field Artillery Brigade. Now, having limited tank shells, very limited tank shells for their Japanese tanks, they had to use them sparingly and only as support for when other units went in as a form of counter-battery fire against these artillery forces to allow the other militia forces to move in for the kill, to outflank some of these forces, surround them in pockets, and go through the streets annihilating them. Now, the regime forces, being heavily outnumbered and largely comprised of woke militias and inexperienced units at this particular battle, they were defeated. But this battle lasted a long time. It lasted many days. And this airport, the regime's main access point for what little flights could make it in due to fuel constraints on the Air Force, and also spare part issues. The situation was even worse when the airport was fully surrounded by a force of 7 different militia elements who surrounded the regime forces into a pocket. And they stayed surrounded there for many days, trying to hold out and not lose the airport. Being that the Northwestern Conservative Army really didn't have any air defense artillery weapons at this battle, flights were still possible to come in to the airport, although they would be under fire upon landing, as the Northwest Conservative Army still had enough firepower to actually hit whatever was on the tarmacs. Now, when they materialized in Union Gap, there was already fighting going on inside the city here as well, where National Security Forces paramilitary in a battalion here and a battalion of Antifa woke militia were down here holding a southern portion of the city against these two militia forces that were already in the area fighting them. They were reinforced by a battalion of the Yakima Indians and also a battalion of their regular militia forces, comprising some 4 battalions. They eventually defeated these 2 battalions here, broke through, and engaged this BLM battalion. By this point, several days had already elapsed in the battle. Also, by this point, several days in, these forces were surrounded in a pocket here. The 1st of the 28th Infantry Battalion here and the 1st of the 23rd Infantry were surrounded and in heavy combat with multiple forces of these 3 militia battalions. This has been going on now for several days. You have to understand, in these battles, these take days, as this is very slow, grueling combat. These forces had already moved in from the north by that point and helped to surround them, and they were primarily located between the artillery and between these infantry forces to break them up a bit and surround them from the western side. In a matter of days, it would soon be over, and these pockets would fall. The BLM pocket fell very quick and fell much faster than these infantry forces here. And the forces that defeated this BLM pocket moved to the west and established themselves here to assault this BLM element before taking positions just to the south of the Field Artillery Brigade, the 17th Field Artillery Brigade here, whose troops, due to limited shells, would become basically an infantry force, having to fight infantry type of battles, as they were virtually out of shells by the 4th day of the battle. This Antifa battalion here came in to try to flank these forces already engaging this pocket of artillery, but they were parried and destroyed in the process. This militia element up here had taken the highway bridge and crossed this tributary here. This highway is the I-82 highway. They took the I-82 highway bridge and they engaged this National Security Forces paramilitary battalion, but also helped to assist the surrounding of this pocket here. By the end of the battle, with all the grueling combat over, most of their regime forces had surrendered, minus very small, a 2,000-man force that remained within this pocket as a harassing force. It was overall a great victory, a strategic victory, although a Pyrrhic victory. It was a great victory for the Northwestern Conservative Army. And roughly about the same time, other battles were taking place in other regions. I take you now to the state of Maine. In southern Maine, there was another battle brewing, as regime forces wanted to seize control over the entire Northeast, but Maine, already being ideologically opposed to globalism and the regime policies, decided to put up a resistance, as its 3%ers militias that now became the Maine militia, a united front, a united force against the regime, uniting with their local Guard units from the Maine National Guard, mostly light units of aviation units, but also there were some light weapons such as mortars and some APCs. Most of the helicopters were out of commission due to a lack of spare parts, but they put up a tremendous resistance against the regime. I will take you now to that battle in just a moment. In the main battle, this battle occurred between July the 5th and August the 31st. The total forces involved were 20,000 of the regime, and there were 40,000 of the newly formed main militia, whose leader's name was Robert Montilier, who unified all the forces into a single force called the main militia. And he was chosen due to his historical knowledge, being a war historian, and his knowledge of battle tactics and strategies. For the obvious reasons, he was chosen to rule and run the main militia forces in southern Maine. The total casualties were 9,000 regime casualties, with 1,850 regime forces being taken as POWs. As for the main militia army, their total casualties were 17,500 casualties, with 2,100 POWs captured by the regime of their forces. The results of this battle was simply this: the regime offensive to take Maine and capture Maine fails and bogs down into a stalemate, a sort of tit-for-tat operations conducted by both sides within this region. And I take you now to the battle map. In this battle, comprising the regime forces of some 20,000, are National Security Forces battalions of the paramilitary alphabet types, foreign volunteer battalions, which were taken from the refugee centers under the regime control from third world nations, also a larger unit called the 2nd Brigade Combat Team out of the 10th Mountain Brigade of the active duty military, and all of its subordinate battalions, and also some Antifa battalions, and even a BLM battalion as well. Or, I'm sorry, 2 BLM battalions, all holding a front line stretching from the Canadian border down to the coast of Maine itself. In the beginning of the battle, lots of movements were conducted as militia forces had to drive what limited vehicles they had due to fuel constraints. They had to drive, or even some cases march, to reinforce the front lines, to keep regime forces out. And most of the combat in this sector was largely a guerrilla-style campaign. The regime hit back with artillery from its 2nd Brigade Combat Team's 2nd Battalion of the 15th Field Artillery Regiment out of the 2nd Brigade Combat Team of 10th Mountain Division. They hit back against the main militia forces here. And keep in mind, the Maine National Guard only had access to light artillery such as mortars and anti-tank weapons such as the older TOW missile systems. But they used them very skillfully as a regime cavalry battalion or cavalry squadron rather, of the 89th Cavalry Regiment of the 2nd Brigade Combat Team. It was the first of the 89th, spearheaded its own assault through the lines, and not realizing how large the forces in the area really were, ended up being surrounded by not only militias, but also these 2 Maine National Guard aviation regiments here, or aviation battalions, actually, It was the 3rd of the 142nd Aviation Regiment, battalion of the 142nd Regiment, again, it's confusing all the numbers, and the 1st of the 224th Aviation Security and Support Battalion. They were surrounded by these two National Guard battalions and a large force of militia, 3 battalions, who surrounded them in a pocket and wore them down over a period of several days. Further to the south, other elements of the 2nd Brigade Combat Team here, in the parentheses, other battalions of them, and along with BLM, foreign volunteer, woke militias, spearheaded an assault into southern Maine, trying to make an assault for Portland and link up on I-95 so that they would have an easier time getting to Portland, which was Maine's biggest city and a short distance away from the battlefield. Due to fuel constraints, that was all the regime could even hope to do, as their fuel stocks were running dangerously low, which is part of why the combat in this area would bog down into a trench warfare style situation after this battle concluded. It would conclude as a stalemate with very little changes in the area. Other forces of the Maine militia came down from further north to reinforce the lines. It took them what ended up being days to arrive, as they had to coordinate logistics for their militia battalions and had to ensure that horse-drawn carriages full of food, water, and ammunition could keep up with what few vehicles they had available to transport troops and materials. You have to understand, in all of these battles for all sides, logistics is the key issue driving the mobilization of forces, the ability to get forces to the front, and also the size of the force at the front. Because as things deteriorated across the land, all sides who depended on railroads at the very beginning of the conflict would soon find that the diesel for railroad operations would not be available in sufficient quantities, as well as fuel for other military vehicles, as over time they began to run out dangerously low. And also other supplies as well, such as food and water, began to get dangerously low, and only limited small-scale offensives could be launched more towards the end of the internal conflict. Although at the beginning, for a short while, there was just enough fuel for some limited operations and mobilizations that led to these fairly large battles, such as this battle here in Maine. I will take you to the next battle, which was one of the largest in the entire internal conflict, as you have to understand that most of this internal conflict was essentially a large-scale series of low-intensity warfare type of operations, wherein there were all types of guerrilla movements and assaults on a very small local scale, as that was all logistics could allow for in most areas. To conduct larger battles, they relied on large logistical trains, and they eventually got to where they required horse-drawn wagons. Even camels that were requisitioned from camel farms in parts of the United States, especially in the Southwest, especially by the Mormon State, as camels could carry heavier loads than horses into battle and also across the deserts, as they required little water. The next battle I will take you to is the battle between the Mormon State and the National Salvation Revolutionary Front in their quest to seize control of Warren Air Force Base and its nuclear arsenal for their own uses, as they sought WMDs and quickly stumbled upon chemical weapons stockpiles, such as the Mormon State stockpiles in Deseret, Utah, and also the Pueblo, Colorado stockpiles of VX and sarin nerve agents that they would use to horrifying effect, as well as the National Salvation Revolutionary Front, who would do much the same, killing hundreds of thousands with nerve agents by the end of the conflict. For the battle that occurred in Cheyenne, this battle occurred early in the conflict, as all sides were mobilizing all they could for a general war. Although, again, it was largely low-intensity warfare most of the war, there were these series of major battles where each side could mobilize forces that numbered in the tens of thousands. So this was one of the larger battles, the battle for Warren Air Force Base in Cheyenne, that occurred between July 10th and July 15th, a 5-day long, but one of the most intense, most bloody battles in the entire civil conflict, as both sides had steadily mobilized. And at the very beginning, after July 1st and July 2nd, when the war officially kicked off with all the coups and factions arising nationwide, all sides were mobilizing for war and using everything they could. The National Salvation Revolutionary Front's core forces of actual defected Army Army Reserve and National Guard units, along with a small amount of active who defected and joined the National Salvation Revolutionary Front, of course brought all their equipment with them. And the NSRF had spread as far west as Wyoming from the central Midwest, as they had loyal followers in Wyoming. And they also had access to some rail infrastructure that was not yet badly damaged enough, or damaged at all rather, to where limited operations by rail could actually be conducted. And they were, as the NSRF rapidly seized Warren Air Force Base from the regime forces there, as they used some of their aviation units with the limited fuel they had available. They used some aviation units that they had to fly over Warren and drop barrel munitions, much like Assad's regime did in Syria, but the NSRF did it to the regime forces in Cheyenne, as well as dropping off some of their aviation infantry forces that were available to them out of their core forces. In the beginning of the battle, the NSRF had access to one cargo plane with barrel munitions that were lit and rolled out of the back of it. They had a C-17 Globemaster from the Air Guard of North Dakota. They also had 10 working Black Hawk helicopters for their aviation units. Only 10 due to fuel constraints and spare parts constraints, as mentioned. And also, not all the ground crew were available, as some were forced to become infantry type of elements, out of necessity more than anything else. Of the Mormon State forces, they slightly outnumbered the NSRF at this battle, as they managed to rapidly seize a lot of Colorado, as many in Colorado took to the call of the Mormon State, as there were large Mormon communities in areas of Colorado, and they managed to convert all the rest who didn't want to line up and convert at first, but eventually they were scared and terrified into converting due to the radical ways of the Mormon State forces, who rode into the region on the limited fuel that they had available from Utah and from their compounds that were in western Colorado on the Rockies. They had 15 Black Hawk helicopters to begin this battle, and that was part of their Joseph Smith's own forces out of the formerly Utah Guard, their National Guard, Army Guard, that joined. And in this battle, there were quite a bit of forces that were held in reserve, as both sides feared a breakthrough, as each side continued to reinforce for the battle that ended in a stalemate, which the stalemate created a temporary truce that was put into effect between the N.S.R.F. and the Mormon State, with the Mormon State permitted and ceded control over Warren Air Force Base and the city of Cheyanne, with the N.S.R.F. forces withdrawing to 5 miles north, 5 miles west, and 5 miles to the east towards the Nebraska state line. But not before the N.S.R.F. forces sabotaged the base and city railroads infrastructure and miles of the tracks to prevent them from future use. Now, keep in mind that at the beginning of the battle, the N.S.R.F. controlled Warren because they had captured it from the regime. What they had done was, with the limited fuel that was already in the train engines that were in the city, within the locomotives themselves, and also in the tanks, the fuel tanks in the city, they loaded up several nuclear weapons onto the trains, the various rail cars, the empty rail cars normally used for transporting vehicles, and they rolled them all the way to the east to Nebraska, where they were to be kept as a bargaining chip to potentially scare other factions. Now, due to the fact that the specific WMDs, the specific nukes that they took with them, were not fully armed, as in they were not fully prepared for detonation and required some small components, the N.S.R.F. was in search for technical experts. Now, when the Mormon State got their hands on what few nukes remained, they, however, did have technical experts, because the Thule Army Depot in Utah, mostly comprised of civilian engineers and technicians and ordnance specialists and robotic experts, because they serviced much of the Army's robotics there for the EOD robots and other such type of robots. They had technical expertise that they could use to actually rig up one of these devices. And that will be mentioned more in the next video, because the Mormon State did manage to use one device to punish a certain other faction that they hated. Being that they were in a truce with the N.S.R.F. at the time, it was not the N.S.R.F. that they used the nuke on. It would be another faction. But that will be mentioned in the next video, when I go into the atrocities committed by all sides. In the beginning of the conflict of this, or in the beginning of this battle, near the beginning of the conflict, the forces of the Mormon State were comprised largely of, hold on, let me get better lighting here. The forces of the Mormon State were comprised largely most of militia forces, but also they were comprised of the 65th Artillery Brigade, which was part of the Utah Guard, which had 155 millimeter howitzers, M198 howitzers, that fired the large 155 artillery pieces, the M198s. And they were comprised also of militia forces, most heavily, and the Called by the Faith forces, now starting to just now filter in to the Mormon State territories. At first, they had to sneak their way in, as the Mormon State had not yet taken over that corridor of New Mexico, of western New Mexico. They had to sneak in to join the Mormon State, but the first Called by the Faith forces eventually arrived and formed up into their respective battalions. And there were several Called by the Faith forces battalions at this particular battle. And also other aspects, other components of the Joseph Smith's own forces, such as the combat veterans of the prior wars that were Mormons or fresh converts, or an amalgamation of some active military that defected to the Mormon State, that had Mormon State sympathies. And also the 29th Special Operations Battalion, which was also actually a Utah Guard unit. They had a Special Forces battalion, and they used them to great effect later in the battle, as they had to wait for their fuel to arrive by camel trains, as the Mormon State, being as low on fuel as it was forced to try to requisition all the fuel they could from their territory. They even had to get to the point to where they were drilling holes in car and other vehicle tanks to get the fuel out of them, much like what we see going on today in our country in different areas. The fuel stealing. Well, the Mormon State had to do similar to requisition fuel that was already in many of the vehicle car tanks. Cars became a rarity in the Mormon State, and then they didn't exist on the roads at all, as all fuel had to be requisitioned. And what few vehicles that did run that were able to be used were strictly for military use only by the Mormon State. So, when the battle began, it started with a very, very long artillery barrage, as the forces had reinforced this area for days. The Mormon State forces used I-25 toward Cheyenne and Warren Air Force Base to primarily reinforce their troops in this area, as other sectors of the front were largely small-scale skirmishes compared to this large battle between small units, as they could not be adequately supplied with their logistical requirements. So I-25 here was where the logistics for the Mormon State came, whereas over here on I-80 here, and also with the rail infrastructure that was not yet too badly damaged or destroyed, going to Warren and also into Cheyenne and beyond, that was how the N.S.R.F. supplied itself for the conflict, for the battle. So as the artillery began to crash from both sides, the N.S.R.F. also had artillery in the form of HIMARS rocket systems and howitzer artillery, as their 2nd Battalion of the 300th Field Artillery and their 141st or their 1st Battalion of the 147th Field Artillery, which was the HIMARS unit, began to send rockets crashing into Mormon State positions all along the battlefront, killing many instantly. But likewise, the Mormon State had HIMARS as well, as these were seized from the Thule Army Depot as they were being serviced there, and they were completed and ready to be sent to other installations. But when the war broke out, they were annexed by the Mormon State. And the munitions stockpiles at Thule Army Depot consisted of many, many types of munitions, as that also served as an installation to where munitions went to either be decommissioned or worked on or other such services, and testing as well. So the Mormon State had access to a very, very large quantity, a huge quantity of artillery shells, C4, anti-tank and anti-personnel mines, and even rockets. Rockets, some were slated to be decommissioned, but they were kept and ended up finding use for the Mormon State. They primarily relied on the Thule Army Depot for their supplies, for their munitions. And the National Salvation Revolutionary Front primarily relied on its many installations scattered throughout much of their territory, which comprised a large portion of the Midwest and sections of the eastern and southeastern United States. And some of the movements at the very beginning were a long and drawn-out battle line conflict here, almost World War I style, when the C-17 Globemaster was used to drop barrel munitions on the Mormon State. The Mormon State retaliated by driving suicide trucks into the front lines and blasting humongous craters into the ground, killing hundreds and sometimes thousands. Many of these units that were at the front had to be reinforced. So the commanders on the ground of the NSRF factions had to send forces as quickly as possible down both the highways and what little they could by rail as the fuel got lower and lower in this region of the United States, as the fuel depots by the rail networks were beginning to be depleted and in a rapid form. So they did all they could to reinforce the casualties they took from the Mormon State, but eventually all the fighting began to wither both sides down into a horrible, horrible state of death and destruction. Eventually, however, though, there were some breakthroughs by the Mormon State, but also counterattacks by the NSRF. One such breakthrough happened just south of the city of Cheyenne here, where these Mormon State battalions, a Joseph Smith's own battalion, a militia battalion, another Joseph Smith's own battalion, and two other militia battalions had battled against one militia battalion of the NSRF that ended up fighting bravely. It ended up fighting bravely, but it was eliminated. And the remaining forces surrounded this other militia battalion and destroyed it, as well as this combat engineer force, which was the 457th Battalion of the Utah Guard, also swung around and pincered this militia battalion here, who in turn was also destroyed before all the concentrated forces headed north into the city itself. And when they arrived, there was panic among the NSRF, who rushed forces to counterattack and help this militia unit providing security inside the city. And also this militia unit tried to counterattack but was parried and came back to fight the forces here in the city that made it in. As all this fighting was going on, other areas of the front began to see some Mormon State breakthroughs, like such as the western part of the front, where numerous Joseph Smith's own and even the foreign called by the faith forces began to send withering suicide vehicle attacks and were thus counterattacked by the C-17 Globemaster that flew over and dropped barrel munitions upon them, scarring the landscape of southern Wyoming, or southeast Wyoming rather, and northeast Colorado. The battle only began to grow more and more intense, but both sides were showing signs of fatigue, and they were beginning to tire. But forces held in reserve were still large enough to where they could continue feeding forces into the battle, and they could continue to fight. One such reserve force was the 1st Squadron of the 143rd Cavalry Regiment. It had already been moved by rail, by flatbed rail cars, as soon as the Warren Air Force Base was seized from the regime by the 1st Battalion of the 189th Aviation Regiment, another Guard unit. Their Echo, Charlie, and Delta companies seized the base and originally requisitioned its nukes for shipment back to Lincoln, Nebraska, via rail car. The 1st Squadron of the 134th was by now seasoned in combat. Even though it was a Guard unit from Nebraska, it was by now seasoned in combat due to the coup that it had participated in for the N.S.R.F., who rose up everywhere and took control of vast swathes of territory. They counterattacked with their tanks, with their Abrams tanks and Bradleys. On the limited fuel they had, they counterattacked all the massing forces and attacking forces of the Joseph Smith's own, foreign volunteers, and others who assaulted the area They parried them and defeated them just north of Interstate 80. These other forces of militia counterattacked the breakthrough forces here. But as all this was going on, the 19th Special Operations Battalion was used to fly its now fueled helicopters as the fuel finally arrived by horse and carriage, or horse and wagon, rather. They began to fly their helos around the battle to avoid any type of air defense fire from 50 calibers or other heavy machine gun weapons. They dipped and dodged and flew in random patterns and landed right here in the Warren Air Force Base, and was met by these 3 companies of 1st Battalion, who had it out with them. By this point, this battalion had already left of this militia forces to counterattack the breakthrough here. But the Spec Ops Battalion was now fighting 3 companies of this battalion here, which was all they had, was these 3 companies left at Warren Air Force Base. So they were now outnumbered by the Joseph Smith's own 19th Special Operations Battalion of the Utah Guard. However, many reserve forces were held further to the east, such as this pocket of militia forces and corps infantry. But these forces ended up hurrying to meet the threat further to the south, and had no time or ability to really be able to help and assist in the capture of Warren, minus maybe 1 battalion who raced in to reinforce this area right here, this 1 battalion of militia forces. And they ended up fighting a large battle over Warren, when finally the commanders of both sides met and decided that the fighting was too brutal and too harsh for both sides, and they agreed to a truce, which ended up becoming an official stalemate as diplomats from both sides met and formed their uneasy truce, as both factions were also diametrically opposed. They both hated the regime, but they also both hated each other equally so. One being a theocratic religious sect out to put America under a radical theocracy, and one being a secular humanist sect who utterly hated organized religions and also globalism equally so. They finally formed their truce, and they agreed to have one final apocalyptic encounter with one another after they each defeated their other enemies, as there were other factions on the map that needed to be dealt with. I will conclude this live as my phone's about to go dead, and I will continue the battle maps in the next video. I hope you enjoyed this and found it educational, and learned about how logistics affect military operations and planning, and why, and how forces have to be mustered and mobilized and according to their logistical requirements, and why. And I hope this, again, taught you about some of the leaders that would emerge for these factions, these maniacs, these psychopaths that would seize control and co-opt various movements and bend them to their desires with their own agendas, apart from that of the elites who they will hate and fight against. And you also saw how easily the regime can lose its grip on power. Just like what happened in Syria, it's no different. You see the regime areas shrunk to small territories of the northeast, small pockets in the southeast, and even in the southwest. With islands such as Detroit and Chicago, and also, of course, California and the coastal parts of Washington and Oregon. If you don't think this could happen in real life, you're gravely mistaken. And all the people that mention the underground bases, well, let me tell you something about those. Those really are not the be-all, end-all as far as like what their abilities are. They look, whatever they brought down into those underground bases is only enough, do you understand, like I've told you all before, just to sustain A 4,000 plus man operation, because it was really 7,000. I mean, yeah, it was 7,000 if you count the 3,000 logistical people involved. But of the 4,000 combat forces on the ground in Operation Saber Tempest, there were thousands of tons of logistics for a 3-month-long operation. 3 months for 4,000 people. Do you understand that in those deep underground bases, that all the stuff that they trucked down in there would only be enough, even over the course of years, it would only be enough for 5 years for 200,000 people. 200,000. 200,000. And 200,000, remember, our military's 2.2 million, so it's 2,200,000. It's not even enough supplies for a force the size of our whole military for 5 years. It's not. So for 200,000 that are going to go down in there and hide out, yeah, it's enough for them. It's enough for them. It's enough because they've been doing it for years. Sort of like how the Chinese have built up for years, but on a much, much larger scale, which is why they controlled entire ports, whole ports, and imported whole units with all their logistics over 20 years. They did the equivalent of 20 desert shields since 2001, owning our ports. For all the years they've owned our ports. So for all the stuff that they've trucked down into these deep underground bases, yeah, it'll last them about 5 years, but it's not enough for that many people for 5 years. It's only enough for 200,000 people. It's not the be-all, end-all, and it sure isn't going to be enough for military operations. It's for them to sustain themselves while they live underground and in their little hidey holes and hide out from everything. I just thought everybody should understand that there's a lot of math involved in this stuff, and it's a lot of stuff that people don't even understand or realize. Because again, just for 4,000 combat troops to occupy a small area of farmlands and villages, it required, and I'm talking about within Diyala province, it required thousands of tons, and I said tons, meaning 2,000 pounds is a ton. So thousands of tons of logistics just to sustain a 3-month operation for 4,000 people. So out of all the tractor trailers, the 18-wheelers that drive stuff down into those dumbs, for all those years, it's only enough for like 200,000 people for 5 years, and that's it. That's it. It would be much less if they tried to send any of that stuff back out, and they wouldn't be able to truck it all back out. Once it's down there, it's down there. Do you understand how depleted our nation's fuel supply is? How depleted it is? We're in the negative. We have to import fuel to sustain us. The regime would not be able to conduct military operations without fuel, without spare parts. Once this nation descends into chaos, the military-industrial complex, you can kiss that goodbye. It's over. Nobody's going to work. Nobody's building nothing. So I wanted to showcase all these concepts in the form of a story and battle maps, and I hope that I've done that well. These are only the first 2 battles. I have a lot more to go. A lot more. So I'll save that for my next video, and I'll make my next one really long. I'll make sure my phone's fully charged for the 3rd video, because I have a lot to cover in the 3rd. I don't have to read a scenario script. I can just go straight into the battles. I hope you enjoyed this part of the documentary, and I'll start the playlist now that I actually have 2 videos I can put in the playlist, and I'll do the 3rd and 4th next. So you all be blessed, and I'm glad for everybody that joined me. I'm just going to check and see who's all here. You do a roll call. Oh, hey, Jen. Hey, baby. Hey, MB. Watchman and Mary and... Yep. Well, welcome. Y'all have a blessed day. Thank you for coming.